Welcome to this video about the Shroud of Turin, which many also call the Shroud of Jesus. It is the most studied artifact in the world today. It is incredibly unique, and many believe it has the very face of Jesus preserved on it. It has two amazing factors. First, the image is just 2 or 3 microns thick and disappears if you get closer than about 8 feet or 2.5 meters to the shroud. This baffles scientists and confirms it's not a work of art or man-made. Second, the image is just on the surface and, according to scientific analysis, was created by a tremendous burst of light, accounting to around 34 trillion watts of energy, taking 1/4 of a billionth of a second to create the image on the shroud. Otherwise, it would have been scorched and the image destroyed. Now, some believe the shroud is a hoax created around 1300 AD. In this video, we'll answer questions like, what is it? Is the shroud found in the Bible? Why is it called the Shroud of Turin? Where is the shroud located today? Has the shroud always been a Catholic relic or artifact? How was the shroud wrapped around the body? What is its historical timeline? What are the arguments supporting the shroud's authenticity? What are the arguments against its authenticity? And at the end of the video, we'll provide some concluding remarks about what we at HolyLandSite.com Ministries think about the shroud, whether it's true or a hoax. As of the time of this filming, there is an offer of $1 million to anyone who can replicate the shroud. No one has been able to do it, even using all of our modern high-tech technology. If it is authentic, the ramifications are absolutely staggering. If you want to know everything about the Shroud of Turin, this video will provide a complete analysis of this extremely unique artifact. So we'll cover every detail and leave no question unanswered in this video. So join us on this fascinating journey as we examine the evidence to determine whether this artifact is authentic or a hoax. Now, what is the shroud? The Shroud of Turin is a 2,000-year-old linen cloth bearing the image of a man who suffered injuries consistent with crucifixion. Many believe it to be Jesus' burial linen cloth, as found in the 4 Gospels in the Bible. The cloth measures about 14.5 feet or 4.4 meters long and about 3.5 feet or 1 meter wide. It is the most studied and researched artifact today. It defies science and is a historical artifact that continues to captivate people worldwide. It has been a subject of religious devotion and scientific scrutiny for years. As we mentioned in the intro, the shroud has 2 amazing factors. First, the image is just 2 or 3 microns thick and disappears if you get too close to it. This baffles scientists and confirms there's something very unique about it. Second, the image is just on the surface and was created by a tremendous burst of light, accounting to around 34 trillion watts of energy, taking 1/4 of a billionth of a second to create the image on the shroud. Otherwise, it would have been destroyed. Now, this next part is very interesting. Science shows that the blood on the shroud was there first, and then the image was created from the massive energy that came later. The shroud is estimated to have several pints of blood on it. So what we have here, when you think about it, is we have evidence of the death and burial of Jesus Christ, and then this image we have evidence of resurrection. So the shroud both has crucifixion evidence and resurrection evidence. Quite amazing. To date, around 102 different scientific disciplines have spent over 600,000 hours studying the shroud, and they virtually all agree it defies science and is unexplainable by natural laws. Now, many photos seen of the shroud's image are photo negatives. This image reproduces bright portions of the photograph subject as dark and the dark parts as light. A natural image doesn't show the details like a negative image. The negative image also has three-dimensional properties which are unexplainable. Now, is the shroud found in the Bible? The Bible affirms Jesus was wrapped in linen cloths or a shroud at his burial in at least 6 places in the Gospels. We'll just read a few so you get the idea. In Matthew 27:57, it says, "When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who also was a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away." In Mark 15:45 it says, "And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph of Arimathea. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock." So the Bible confirms that Jesus was wrapped in the shroud. Now, why is it called the Shroud of Turin? It has this name because it has been stored in Turin, Italy since 1578. The Shroud of Turin is also widely known as the Shroud of Jesus. Where is the shroud located today? It's stored at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. It's housed in a climate-controlled case in a chapel built just to hold it. However, because of its extremely fragile state, the shroud is not viewable to the public except during very rare public viewings as the Pope determines. Has the shroud always been a Catholic relic or artifact? No. The House of Savoy entrusted the Shroud of Turin to the Catholic Pope and each succeeding Pope in 1983. Some say it was also entrusted to the Vatican. So it is technically not entrusted to the Catholic Church, although there is interfacing that takes place. It has been in the hands of many people and places throughout its long history. Now, how was the shroud wrapped around the body? I have an example here of what I'm going to show you. So what we have here is the shroud. The paper represents the shroud. This represents the body. At the top would be the head. So the shroud would be placed in the tomb, and then the body would be placed on top of the shroud, and then the shroud would be folded over the body like this, so you would have the shroud on the top and on the bottom. The shroud didn't touch every part of the body because of the distance and spacing in between. And then they would wrap several different linen straps around the shroud. And then they would have a head covering as well. So that's how then the shroud was placed over the body. And what we see today in the images, we see images from the top, then we see images from the bottom side. This is also consistent with Lazarus being raised from the dead as found in John chapter 11, verse 43. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. We see exactly that the shroud matches what is consistent with New Testament burials in Israel and Jerusalem. Now, how tall would the person be who was in the shroud? According to the image on the shroud, the body would have been about 6 feet or 1.83 meters tall. This is taller than the average height of a person in Israel during the time of Jesus. However, this would be consistent with Jesus because in order to minister to the multitude, he had to be taller than the people. If he was short, he would have been down in the crowd and the people wouldn't have been able to see him or hear him. So it's perfectly consistent. Also, we know that the first king of Israel, Saul, was head and shoulders above all the other people. He was a king. Jesus was also a king, so it would be appropriate for him to be taller than the others. So his height is perfectly consistent with Jesus and what would have taken place at that time. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do a brief walk through the history of the shroud, where it began, where it is now. We begin in 33 AD. The Bible describes Jesus being wrapped in a linen cloth after the crucifixion. We've looked at this. Some believe the shroud was kept secretly by early Christians because of persecution from the Roman Empire. Then towards the latter part of the first century, let's say about 100 AD, legend and folklore speak of a mysterious cloth with healing power bearing an image of Jesus that arrived in Edessa, now Urfa, Turkey, in the 1st century AD. The Apostle Thaddeus, one of the original apostles of Jesus Christ, is associated with bringing the cloth from Jerusalem to Edessa. In 525 AD, after a severe flood destroyed most of Edessa, the cloth was removed from the walls where it had been stored for over 400 years. The cloth became known as the image of Edessa, and later was called the true likeness of Christ, not made with human hands. And then as a result, all Orthodox icons of Jesus and Byzantine coins dramatically changed to conform to this true likeness image. This image featured a man with long hair, a full beard, large eyes, and a flattened nose, all of which are stylistically similar to the shroud image. Additionally, Byzantine texts describe a folded cloth bearing the image of Jesus, not made by human hands, hidden in the wall of Edessa as well. So we see a lot of things happening in this area of Edessa. Then in 944 AD, the Byzantine imperial army invaded Edessa to retrieve the cloth from the city that had fallen to Islam. The cloth was taken to Constantinople, now Istanbul, and presented to the emperor there. The cloth was reportedly shown during church feasts and festivals during this period as well. In 1203 AD, a document from French crusader Robert de Clary describes a cloth in Constantinople showing the full body of Christ displayed every Friday. Many believe this refers to the shroud. In 1204 AD, the Fourth Crusade invaded Constantinople and the revered cloth disappeared. Some historians believe that the shroud was held in secret possession by the Knights Templar before 1356, when it was displayed in France. Vatican research from 2009 supports this long-time oral tradition. In 1354, the shroud reappeared in the hands of French Knight Geoffrey de Charny, who displayed it at a church he founded in Liry, France. In 1453, Geoffrey's granddaughter, Marguerite de Charny, gave the shroud to the royal house of Savoy. In 1502, the shroud was no longer displayed in different churches within the House of Savoy Kingdom, but was given a permanent home in the royal chapel at Chambéry, also known as Sainte-Chapelle. In 1532, something bad happened to the shroud. A fire damaged the shroud in Chambéry Chapel where it was stored. A drop of molten silver from the container produced a symmetrically placed mark through the layers on the folded cloth. And you can see today we have these symmetrically placed marks on the cloth that came from this fire damage. Then a group of nuns called the Poor Clare group repaired the image with patches. Some have suggested that the water damage also occurred when the fire was being extinguished due to this fire. And the burn marks are still visible. So we can see on this shroud, once again, the burn marks. Then we can also see water damage. So it's believed that the fire damage and the water damage all occurred at the same time when it was at the Chambéry Chapel. In 1578, it was moved to Turin, Italy, where it has remained to this day. So here is an overview of the shroud's entire journey from Jerusalem in 33 AD to arriving in Turin in 1578. Now, this next topic is going to be quite fascinating, so follow along and listen carefully. Now, what are the arguments supporting the shroud's authenticity? The image itself is a mystery. It is unexplainable. The image on the shroud is not painted, drawn, or dyed. No pigment or brushstrokes have been found on it. When viewed as a negative image, it appears more detailed and lifelike. This is something that wasn't understood until it was first photographed in 1898. The image also contains 3D information, which is extremely rare. When processed by image analyzers like the NASA VP-8, it produces a three-dimensional relief unlike typical photographs or paintings. So it produces like a topographical 3D shape. Amazing. The marks on the shroud match exactly with the wounds of the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, this is going to be really amazing, and this is one of the strong evidences that supports the fact that this shroud really seems to be that of Jesus. The bloodstains on the head are compatible with a crown of thorns, and the crown wasn't like a ring that you might see. It was more like a helmet, a full crown, so to speak. And that poked into the head of Jesus, producing a lot of blood. And what's interesting is on the top of the head, it's very, very sensitive. So we can see all throughout the head of Jesus marks from this crown of thorns. And what's interesting is that no person in recorded history in the Roman Empire was ever crucified with a crown of thorns. So just validates it and is compatible, consistent with that of Jesus's crucifixion. Now, the shroud didn't touch every part of the body, but considering the parts it did touch, there are over 120 scourge marks, creating over 370 lacerations. However, it's estimated that the body would have had over 700 lacerations because, again, the shroud didn't touch every part of the body. This is compatible and consistent with Roman flogging and what Jesus endured. He suffered at the house of Caiaphas, and then he went before Pilate where he was beaten and flogged. Then he went before Herod where he was beaten and flogged. Then he came back to Pilate where he was beaten and flogged severely, then condemned to crucifixion. We also have nail wounds in the wrist. Roman crucifixion generally put nails through the wrist to better support the weight of the body on a cross. Nails through the hand typically wouldn't support the weight and rip through. The wrist was considered part of the hand during this period. So the nails would go right in through here so that they would hold the weight on the cross. If they were placed here through the hands, then they could rip the flesh, then the body would fall down. We also have nail wounds in the feet. And in this case, they were one on top of the other. So you'd have one foot down, the other one on top, and then a nail that went through both of them to the post on the cross. The legs are slightly bent due to rigor mortis, a muscle stiffness that sets in quickly after death and lasts less than 4 days. After 4 days, the muscles relax and the body becomes limp. Interestingly, Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days and nights in the tomb. So if it would have been longer, the body would have relaxed and become limp. In this case, however, the body still retains this rigor mortis state, so the legs are slightly bent up and the head is partly tilted down. And then blood from the body runs downward, showing evidence of the man being crucified. There are also no stains or signs of the body decomposing. This is compatible with Jesus' resurrection, which happened on the 3rd day before the body had time to decay. Interestingly, we also have a wound in the side, compatible in size with a Roman spear tip. So we know that Jesus was pierced through, went through his rib up into his heart, blood and water flowed out. So we have on the shroud exact evidence, the size and shape of a Roman spear in the exact spot that would have pierced Jesus. And then as a result of this spear wound, we have post-mortem blood that flowed from the side wound and then flowed around the back part of the body. Now the man's legs were not broken, which is consistent with what happened to Jesus. Interestingly, the 2 men crucified with Jesus Both had their legs broken. Now, why would they break the legs of people being crucified? Well, in order to breathe, your arms are stretched out, your feet are nailed to the cross. In order to breathe, you have to push up and pull up so that the diaphragm works. If not, then you suffocate rapidly. Usually, they would leave people on the cross for days to die a slow, painful death. And then because it was the day before the Passover, they broke the legs of the two other criminals. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they did not break his legs. This fulfills prophecy and is also something very unique about the crucifixion of Jesus. I just want to say here for a moment that Jesus was crucified very differently than other people. And according to Roman history, there was no other person crucified quite like Jesus. The crown of thorns, spear, and there's just a lot of factors that were unique about Christ's crucifixion. And what's interesting, as we're seeing, is that this shroud matches perfectly with Jesus' account of his crucifixion. We also have marks on the back of the man from carrying a wooden beam. This is consistent with Jesus carrying his cross. So Jesus, we know, went to Golgotha carrying his cross. Some would say it was just the beam. Some would say it was the whole cross. Doesn't really matter, but he has marks from the cross on his back, and we can see this in the shroud, again, consistent with what Jesus endured. We also have this deviated septum in the nose, and this would have been created or caused by the heavy blows Jesus received in his face by Roman soldiers. Some would say that Jesus' nose was broken. That's what we would say today, but technically the nose has no bone. It's made up of cartilage. So in this case with Jesus, because of the heavy blows, his whole nose was reshaped and moved over to the side somewhat. And if you have ever been hit in the nose or bumped to something, your eyes water. It's absolutely just a pain that's really quite excruciating. We also have on the shroud a blood type that is AB, a Jewish blood type found in less than 3% of the world's population in a certain area. So the shroud appears to have originated from Israel because this is where this blood type is, and it's of Jewish origin. So quite amazing. The blood is real human blood and shows signs of the chemical bilirubin. It's produced by the liver during extreme trauma or stress. This is consistent with the traumatic injuries that Jesus would have suffered. Now, interestingly, the blood on the shroud is reddish. Normally, blood turns blackish when exposed to oxygen. However, the chemical bilirubin keeps the blood reddish and stops it from turning blackish, which is again consistent with Christ's sufferings before and during crucifixion. We also have pollen, dust, and plant evidence on the shroud, which shows great evidence that this shroud was the shroud of Jesus. The pollen grains found on the shroud are from plants native to Jerusalem. Some of these plants bloom only in the spring around the time of Passover. When was Christ crucified? At Passover, in the spring, so this will be consistent with Jesus' account of being crucified. Additionally, other pollen on the shroud matches perfectly with the places the shroud has traveled throughout its history, such as Jerusalem, northern Syria, Turkey, and around Europe. We also have limestone dust from Jerusalem on the shroud. So again, we have these different pollens, this limestone, these different things that are very consistent with Jesus and this shroud. Now, the shroud itself is quite interesting. It is made of expensive cloth using the exceptionally durable herringbone weave pattern. It was rare but well known in the ancient Middle East and is consistent with first century Jewish burial cloths. It perfectly matches the Bible's account of being donated by Joseph of Arimathea, who was very wealthy. So the linen cloth, this shroud, was very unique in that it was specially woven, it was very expensive, it was extremely durable. That's why it could last all of these years, and it was very costly, and it was bought by Joseph of Arimathea, very wealthy, then placed upon Jesus. So all this is consistent, again, with the account of Jesus. Now, some would say that how can a linen shroud or any piece of clothing endure or last for such a long time? Well, we have other ancient clothing that has been preserved. Some are as old as 5,000 years. So it's not abnormal to have ancient clothing being preserved for a long time. A Byzantine coin from 692 AD shows Jesus on a cross resembling the shroud's face. We also have a lot of scientific affirmation that the Shroud of Turin is authentic. We'll look at this just a little bit. In 1978, King Umberto II, the owner of the shroud at that time, authorized comprehensive hands-on testing for a group called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, also known as STURP. The group was made up of over 30 highly distinguished professional scientists. STURP's findings remain a primary scientific source cataloging the shroud's unique properties to this day. Here is a partial list of what the STURP findings concluded. No substances were manually applied to the cloth. No artistic substances such as paint, ink, dye, pigments, or stain were used to create or constitute the image. No collagen binder, as would be used with paint, was found. No fibers are cemented to each other, as would be the case with paint if it was a painted-on application. No liquids were applied to form the image on the shroud. No substances were found between the threads, as with dust rubbing. Bloodstains on the cloth tested positive for heme, bile, serum, and albumin, and other human blood components. The blood is of the male type, AB. The blood marks seen on the shroud are consistent with a contact transfer to the cloth of blood clot exudates that would have resulted from the major wounds inflicted on a man who died in the position of crucifixion. The image is purely superficial. It does not penetrate the cloth, but only rests on the top 2 microfibers. This is similar to the shroud image resting on the hairs of your forearm. So the image, the blood goes clear through the cloth, but the image is just on the very top part, like the fibers of your hair. And once again, if you get too close, the image is lost. You have to get back from the image a bit to see it. So this image is really what fascinates people more than anything. The blood on the shroud is one thing, but this supernatural image is just really interesting. The image is a photographic negative that develops as a positive. The image contains 3D distance information, similar to a topographical map. No directionality to the image, as found with a brush or any substance application tool, has been found. So in other words, if it was painted on or brushed on, then the hairs, the fibers of the cloth should tilt, but they don't. There's no manipulation of the fibers. There's no variation in the depth of this image. So once again, this image is very interesting. And so to try to duplicate this image would be virtually impossible with human hands. The yellowing of the image is uniform in intensity. No outline or defined edges are found on the image. So here are the conclusions of STURP's findings. This is what they say. This is their summary. There are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. In other words, this image defies natural laws. We can't explain it. We just can't understand this. It's something, in essence, out of this world. It's something supernatural, is really what they're saying. Now, in addition to the STURP's findings, we have now later scientific affirmations using our high-tech technology that is quite impressive. As mentioned earlier, it's impressive that around 102 different scientific distinguished disciplines have spent over 600,000 hours studying the shroud. Quite amazing. And they have concluded that the age of the shroud now, using our latest technology, is about 2,000 years old, matching the exact time of Jesus. The Institute of Crystallography in Italy has confirmed, using wide-angle X-ray scattering technology, also known as wax, that the Shroud of Turin is 2,000 years old. As we alluded to earlier, Paolo di Lazzaro of Ania Laboratory in Italy conducted a 5-year study and calculated that it would have taken 34 trillion watts of energy, taking 1/4 of a billionth of a second to create the image on the shroud. Otherwise, it would have been scorched and the image destroyed. The image is just 2 or 3 microns thick and disappears, as we've mentioned, if you get too close to the shroud. This baffles scientists and confirms it's not a work of art or man-made. Now, what are the arguments against its authenticity? We have some critics, that's fine. What are their arguments? They have 3 basic arguments. The first is radiocarbon dating. In 1988, the Vatican provided 3 laboratories in 3 different countries with a postage stamp-sized piece of the shroud's linen cloth. Carbon-14 dating from all 3 laboratories concluded that the cloth had been made sometime around 1260 to 1390 AD, thus indicating that it was not authentic and was a hoax. As a result, this news hit all the news outlets and became a major story. It seemed the shroud was proven to be a forgery from the Middle Ages. However, some scientists raised serious doubts about the researchers' methodology. Recently, it has been verified that the test piece from the shroud was from repairs that have been carefully done on a corner of the linen shroud and not from the actual fabric itself. So what happened is you have the shroud, it's handled all around the edges. Well, one of the edges, one of the corners that was damaged was repaired by these nuns back in about 1300 AD. And it was this piece, this corner, that was used for this radiocarbon dating that dated back to 1300 AD, which would be consistent because that's when it was repaired. However, the sample wasn't done from inside the shroud, and so therefore it was from a piece that was newer. That's why the radiocarbon goes back to 1300 AD, not back to 2000 AD. Based upon these recent test results, the Vatican encouraged scientists to conduct further investigation of the shroud's authenticity. In 2022, researchers in Italy published the results of a study in which they used the technology of wide-angle X-ray scattering, wax, that we've talked about, to analyze a small piece of the shroud. And it was done from more of the interior of the shroud. The study concluded that the structural degradations of the shroud's linen were fully compatible with those of another linen sample dating to about 55 to 74 AD, right back close to the time of Jesus. The 2022 study's results bolstered the hypothesis that the Shroud of Turin truly is from the time of Christ. So the 2022 study basically nullified the 1988 study of the radiocarbon dating. So it has been overwhelmingly proven by scientists and late technology that the 1988 radiocarbon dating was not accurate. Some of the critics also argue that the image could have been created using medieval methods, such as bas relief or other artistic techniques. However, recent discoveries and the most recent technology have totally nullified these claims. And as I mentioned earlier, there's an offer of $1 million to anyone who can replicate the image using all of our high-tech technology. It can't be done. So this image was not a forgery, it was not a hoax, it was not created in the medieval times. Critics also say that the shroud lacked historical documentation throughout its entire history. Some argue that its documented history only begins in 1356, roughly AD, leaving a supposed gap from its beginning until then. An essential fact about the shroud's history is that it has 2 distinct periods. The first is before 1356, and it's based on circumstantial evidence, legend, art, coins, folklore, and some documentation. The second is after 1356, when the shroud's history is documented by historical writings. However, the shroud's timeline before 1356 is quite verifiable and credible. Legends, art, coins, some written documentation, folklore, tradition are all commonly valued highly when attempting to verify historical events. This is something we use all the time in dating historical things. We're taking all of these things into consideration. So the same standards should apply to the shroud as well. Now, just because the history from its beginning to 1356 is not documented as well as after that, does not nullify all of the folklore, all of the tradition, some written documentation, and etc. And it also doesn't nullify all of the scientific tests that have been done recently about it. So it's really a very weak argument against the shroud's authenticity. So when you look at the evidence for the shroud's authenticity, and then you look at the critics' arguments against it, the arguments against its authenticity really are very weak and easily explained. So what are some concluding remarks? What is the position of HolyLandSite.com Ministries? We have a number of different thoughts to share with you, very, very important thoughts. Whether or not the shroud is authentic doesn't affect the historicity of Jesus and our faith. We have overwhelming evidence for the existence of Christ and His death and resurrection, so the shroud isn't needed to prove this. Someone has said that if we stack the written evidence supporting the shroud's authenticity, it would reach the ceiling height in a typical house. The evidence against the shroud's authenticity amounts to a few weak arguments that we've already looked at and explained. As mentioned earlier, as of the time of this filming, there is an offer of $1 million to anyone who can replicate the shroud. No one has been able to do it, even using all our modern high-tech technology. With this being the case, it's virtually impossible that the shroud could be a forgery from the Middle Ages. The shroud's authenticity is beyond a reasonable doubt and overwhelmingly proves sufficient evidence to convince any modern-day doubting Thomas. Now, the DNA of Jesus is not available, so the shroud can never be 100% proven to be his burial cloth. However, the evidence is so overwhelming. Everything matches up as we looked at all of the crucifixion marks. Everything lines up perfectly with what the Bible's account is and what the shroud's account shows. The fact that the shroud exists and has been preserved for around 2,000 years strongly suggests its high value and supernatural preservation. It is not just any old cloth that endures for millennia if something special isn't going on. So no one just preserves and protects and goes to great lengths to preserve some piece of cloth that really doesn't amount to anything. It has been preserved because of its value. And it could be argued that God supernaturally created it and He supernaturally preserved it for us to see it. And especially today with our technology, we can see things now that couldn't have been seen up until roughly 100 years ago. Quite fascinating. Now, historian John Walsh gives us a good perspective on the shroud. This is what he says. The shroud is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Christ in existence, or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is either one or the other. There is no middle ground. So in his words, it's either true or it's not. You can't land somewhere in the middle because, as we've mentioned, to create this image, we can't do today, even with our modern day technology. So if we can't do it today, we don't believe it could have been done in the Middle Ages. After 4 decades of devoted study to the Shroud of Turin, the French historian Jean-Christian Petitfils is fully convinced that the face unveiled to the world by the Italian photographer Segundo Pie in 1898 is indeed that of Jesus Christ in the tomb. So what is our position at HolyLandSite.com Ministries? This is our view. If we took the evidence and we took it to a court of law, if we had the evidence supporting the authenticity of the shroud and the arguments against the authenticity, it would be a slam dunk in a court of law. The evidence is so overwhelming, it would just totally annihilate the evidence against its authenticity. So we believe, based upon all the evidence, that the shroud is authentic. That's our position. So if the shroud is authentic, and if it is true, we have something quite amazing in our hands. We have an artifact, again, that is the most studied artifact that has ever been known. Nothing gets more attention than the Shroud of Turin. So if it is true, and we believe it is, what are some faith lessons that we can take away from this shroud? Well, number one, Jesus voluntarily submitted to the most horrible manner of death possible to pay for our sins and grant us eternal life. The shroud provides additional evidence of what Jesus suffered for us. The 120 flogging marks, around 700 lacerations, and all of these beatings show His love for us. Romans 5:8 says, "But God shows or demonstrates His love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." So what about us? Have we received Christ's gift of salvation, and are we grateful for all He did for us, and do we appreciate His love? He really shows His love in the crucifixion, and this shroud really captures His love for us today. Next, the physical sufferings Jesus endured to pay for our sins was overwhelming. However, the spiritual suffering He paid was even greater. So what about us? Do we understand maybe even just a little bit how much Jesus loves us and wants to have a relationship with us? Why did He do all this? Because He wants a relationship with us. What was lost in the Garden of Eden when man turned away from God and that relationship was lost, now Jesus wants to restore. He wants a relationship with His created beings. He loves His created beings. He loves you, He loves me. So the shroud captures and shows this. Then next, regardless of whether the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we have so much more evidence supporting the death and resurrection of Jesus. We don't really need the shroud. It's nice to have, but we don't need it. So what about us? Do we believe the truthfulness of the resurrection of Jesus, or are we skeptical and unbelieving? In Hebrews 3:12 it says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God." So unbelief really is, God calls it, evil. So what about us? Do we believe all the historical accounts of Him, that they are authentic? Jesus was a real historic figure, and that can be proven and shown throughout history and all of the evidences supporting it. With this overwhelming evidence that the shroud is authentic, we are not to worship it in any way. We can venerate it, we can appreciate it, we can be very, very grateful for it, but we are not to worship it. We are to worship God alone, not a thing. So we don't want to give it an inappropriate place in our thinking. And then lastly, the evidence for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin meets the standard of truthfulness beyond a reasonable doubt. Thus, we have an accurate representation, really, of the face of God found in Jesus Christ. So thank you for watching, and may God richly bless you.